Thank you, Christine. I'm thrilled to be here today, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining in. I really wish we could all be in person. I'm still green at doing the virtual presentations, but we'll make it through this, and I'm going to go ahead and try to share the screen. If I can. Let's see. Have it in a second. And of course, the phone rings. Okay, can y'all see, Christine, can you see the, great.
Yes.
Okay, let me hit play. Okay, I think we're ready now. Yes, okay. Well, what I wanted today is, I think it's again a great opportunity to be here virtually, to share a lot of lessons learned, and to hopefully get some good feedback, because I'm very much a student, still learning, still trying to improve the ways that my colleagues and I assist historic property owners across North Carolina communities. And this presentation is really meant to share some lessons learned, some tips, but to really help us all be a little bit better prepared for future weather events. And a real shout out to Burgwin-Wright House. It was a year ago, almost a year ago, that I drove down for a great presentation by Jack Fryer on Charlestown. I took an afternoon off, drove down, even got the book and got it autographed. My wife's read it, I've read it, it's great. But just the programming and events that the site has done over the years has really been amazing. And it's sad, of course, that really haven't been able to do any over the last year, but I'm thrilled that you're starting back, and then I have the opportunity to present this virtual presentation. Also like to shout out to our cultural resources, our CREST emergency resource team, CREST, Adrian Burney, who helped coordinate this program. And I'll talk a little bit more about that further in the program. And also to my restoration colleague, Jeff Adolson, who's our senior restoration specialist. Jeff covers the Southeastern region in North Carolina, including New Hanover County. And I think he's on speed dial for a lot of folks in your area. Jeff's a great resource. We teamed together. He invited me to work on a presentation, kind of a maintenance program, a couple of years ago at the site. And we included a section on disaster recovery and preparedness. And certainly what you've done at the Burgwin-Wright House is truly amazing. You're not only have done some substantial repairs and maintenance work to the house, but also kind of building in disaster preparedness into the work. And being prepared, I'm trying to do the best I can here. I've put away all of our squeaky toys, Winston squeaky toys, so hopefully we won't have many interruptions other than the phone ringing a minute ago. But the region that I cover is 18 counties in the Northeast. I've put New Bern in. My colleagues and I work together occasionally when there are disasters in both preparedness and follow-up, assisting constituents. And we spent a lot of time in New Bern after Florence. And my colleague also was a huge help, or colleagues, I'd say Jeff and John and others were a huge help in Ocracoke after Dorian last year. But Northeastern North Carolina is rich with cultural heritage properties. We are so fortunate, like you have in other parts of the state, to have these really very historically and architecturally important properties, like the oldest dated house in Edenton that we're still trying to figure out, dated 1718. Also in Edenton, this charming mill property that was recently rehabilitated with the historic preservation tax credits for a rental property. There are many, many, many historic properties that are being renovated currently in the region for residential properties and also commercial. lots of activities in Elizabeth City. This large building on the right, the Weatherly Candy Factory, it was in process of being renovated when one of the hurricanes came through. Luckily, nothing happened, but many of the windows were barely hanging in. So, but it's a great success story, a lot of effort and resources going into reviving our communities. And a tremendous shout out to our grassroots organizations. In many ways, I think they've led the growth and preservation with taking on projects for community good, such as this youthful group of 70-year-olds that championed the rescue of this once endangered Rosenwald School in Williamston, and were hugely successful in getting volunteers to help them get this project underway. The roof was donated, and one of the cleverest ideas I've ever seen was inviting contractors to come on weekends. They said, "We will feed you well," and do some of the work that they really did not want volunteers to do, like up on scaffolding and doing pretty significant repairs. But they eventually were able to secure funds to complete most of the work. But just amazing organizations like all across the state, and certainly our state historic sites and our national neighbors, our National Park Service with the amazing project of the rehabilitation of the Wright brothers National Memorial Visitor Center, which is a National Historic Landmark. Really great projects. And when you think about our coastal region, we think typically about our storms impacting our coastal regions. And two of the things that I really want to focus on in this presentation is, one, why prepare? Why is it important to prepare? And two, just touching on some of the tips and lessons learned that I hope will be of great value to you. And also, again, sharing ideas that you have so that we can help, again, be better prepared to help our constituents. When we think about hurricanes, typically we think about the coast. And NC State did this really helpful chart that shows the paths of typical 3 paths that these tropical cyclones take. And wow, you see how it covers a good bit of our state. And if you overlay our GIS map of historic properties across North Carolina, you can see how much of our state is actually impacted, have been impacted by tropical cyclones. And certainly the lessons continue. This is something that I wish we had no experience in whatsoever, but sadly it's part of our story. And a few clips. The best lessons have been, of course, when you have damage at your own property. I've been there many times. And also when you're doing disaster recovery assistance. And I encourage anybody that has an interest in volunteering to please consider this. This is something that is incredibly difficult, but it is incredibly rewarding. And this is one of my favorite people I have ever met. She lives in Pass Christian, Mississippi. Her home was flooded up to the ceiling. And I went in with, volunteered with the National Trust and went down, and we paired with structural engineers. We went in to do an assessment of her home to see how bad the damage was and if it could be repaired. She was delightful. We went all through her home and went outside afterwards and gave her the good news that it can be repaired. And walked her through it and comforted her with the information. And she came up and hugged us about it. Well, while we were looking at the house, we noticed that she kept taking things out of the home, looking at them and putting them in a pile. And as we approached her, she had this really wonderful tin enamel pan or basin that she was holding and just looking at it. And then she put it in the pile and came over and greeted us. And I asked her, I said, "Ma'am, are you throwing these things away?" And she said, yes. She said that Someone came by and said, if the floodwaters touched it, you have to throw it away. You can't keep anything. And we said, no, ma'am, you actually can keep that. Most of these items, other than the upholstered furniture, can be cleaned, sanitized. So she went over, picked it up, put it aside, and she said, this is my favorite possession. This is what my grandmother bathed me in when I was a child. And she came over and hugged us. And I can say there were some tears shed at that moment. But just having the information, having the knowledge, it is from these experiences that I think we can all share, help each other. So why prepare now? Well, it's kind of the calm before the storm. We have the opportunity, and we have the opportunity, as Christine was saying earlier, to use technology to connect together and discuss and brainstorm and help each other out. So we'll share, and it might be something minor. And this is our office building. We were not prepared for a major water valve that leaked all weekend when we went in Monday morning and discovered water all in the ground floor and in the basement. We were not prepared. We did not have enough towels and buckets. And I can say I've got one eye open from a leak in our bathroom yesterday, and I've had to pull up half our tiles. So luckily I had tiles and a shop vac and everything to prepare for that. So you just never know what might happen. It may be something relatively minor like this. It's going to be a headache, but being prepared, certainly. But this is a kind of overwhelming challenge, like Hurricane Florence, Floyd, Dorian, and others, that seen really creates almost a nightmare situation for a lot of property owners who are nowhere near prepared. I mean, you can't be prepared for something quite like this, but you can do things that can achieve a lot of peace of mind in the process. And I think if I leave any message today, it's really trying to be prepared. And it doesn't have to be a grueling task. It's actually something that, we have this opportunity now to do things that will make this a lot easier to handle. And one of the things is to start kind of researching, pulling together materials. And if you have a historic property, you could go to our State Historic Preservation Office website, and we've got several papers that have been written, short briefs and guides, a link to a video and other material that could be very helpful, could be a good starting place. Certainly you could go to the FEMA website, but for historic properties, there's a lot out there. One of the tools that, I'm not going to go through all of this morning, but this is a paper that we did for a CREST program, showing kind of recommended steps for homeowners. And these are based on what we've observed and also dealt with ourselves on properties. And the key being, of course, things like making sure you've got adequate insurance. I've heard many times from property owners that we didn't have adequate insurance. We didn't realize this wasn't covered. So review your policy, meet with your insurance agent, go over it. They can certainly help you through this. Documentation, gosh, having current photographs. And this is not a real difficult thing to do, but going around with a camera, with a video camera, every room, all elevations on the outside. And then once you transfer this material to a disk or a floppy, or not a floppy, but a thumb drive or prints, just keep a copy off site. I've worked with flooded properties where people lost everything, at least all their records of what was in there. And they had a very difficult time working with their insurance company. So make sure you have copies off site somewhere that's secure. And supplies, kind of, and it's a case-by-case basis. This is a building where they had a roof leak after a minor windstorm, a surprise windstorm. And luckily this building was in the process of being renovated, so it didn't do too much damage, but they really didn't have adequate buckets to collect the water as it was coming in. Sorry, going backwards. And so the list will vary a lot. And this is something that when we had, I think the last hurricane, as most people do, I would run out 2 weeks before, a week before we felt like it was coming, and I made a list. I ran to the hardware store and I looked at my bill. It was about $500, and that hurts. What you can do now is kind of go through and figure out what are the things that I really need for a storm. And then every time you go to the hardware store, kind of spread it out over time, you can start purchasing equipment. The larger Rubbermaid kind of containers are great for storing tarps, for storing rope, other things inside. I pick up a 5-gallon bucket about every time I go to a hardware store and stack them up. They're useful for so many things, but at least you'll have plenty of things on site. And always try to pick up something for a neighbor or an elderly person or a friend in the process as well, that can actually go out and pick up things as often. So I think it's just kind of being prepared over time with whatever supplies you might need. And part of the supply kit is to start copying material, things. This is some of the material that I actually read before we went to Mississippi, which was very helpful, and knowing and being able to give, even though they were there to provide homeowners with information about buildings, we're often asked about personal family heirlooms, and it's shocking to see diplomas and photographs and things out on the curb when they get damaged that could be repaired. So this is a great tool to have. And when if you're doing disaster recovery work, or if you're in a disaster, you lose power, you may not be able to access this information if it's online. You may not have a Wi-Fi signal. So it's really important, I think, to print out information sheets and put them in notebooks. And I keep those notebooks in a container that's waterproof, along with other documents in case. So these are some of the things that could be tremendously helpful. This was a wonderful tool. This is a National Heritage Task Force Emergency Response Salvage Wheel. And on one side, it's really for disaster responders. It's about safety, inspecting your buildings. And on the other side, some great brief tips for materials that get wet, fire damage, smoke damage. Very helpful wheel, and it's fairly inexpensive, but this you can put on your refrigerator, but it's a great resource to have. And for organizations, one of the lessons learned was that local fire department can be very helpful in kind of doing some training with staff about using fire extinguishers. We've done this through our CREST team to some degree, but also just contacting your local fire department, meeting with them, bringing them to your site, kind of identifying what are the important things in the building in case they need to be taken out. But you do get fire, sadly, during storms. And a friend of mine who's a firefighter told me this horror story about this medieval church. This is not a photograph of it, but just a graphic, but that firemen went to put out the fire and they just broke a window out. They didn't know that the window they broke out was a medieval period window. The one next to it was a replica. So knowing that information ahead of time can be invaluable. And for organizations, showing the layout of a house, a building, certainly where you might be a good place to break in, where the panel box is. And also you can add in collections, desks, chairs, things that are important to your museum or to your gallery. And this information can be kept with the fire department. As a matter of fact, they can actually pull it up on a screen as they're driving to a site. They can digitize this information so they can be better prepared to help you in the event of a fire or some other catastrophic damage, like a tree falling on a house, which has happened, and fire department is shown up to help. So, and I think also the challenges of disaster can be an opportunity to work together with your community. And now is really the time to do it. And you can do it through a morning coffee or virtual coffee or tea or whatever your preference might be, but an opportunity to really get together with your community and start brainstorming. What are the risks? How can we be better prepared? How can we be more resilient? And for example, the City of Raleigh has on their website some great guidance on property damage to a property after disaster. And certainly there are a lot of things that come up, and this can reduce, I think, a lot of stress to know that you have this information accessible. How do you deal with building permits? What do you do following a disaster? So a lot of communities are really embracing this, updating historic district guidelines to include disaster assistance. So this is something that can be a really useful tool. We'll kind of step now into some of the lessons learned that we'll kind of share things that, and as I said, we're still very much a student, learning every disaster. And after Florence was just an eye-opener. I've seen this happen before, but after Florence, lots and lots of property owners, contractors, well-meaning, were actually tearing out historic fabric out of buildings. I mean, just an alarming rate. Woodwork that could be salvaged, could be reused. Not only was it loss of historic fabric, but also loss of, in many cases, sustainable material that would have been better off to have cleaned it, kept it, and then versus replacement. And this is an example of a flooring in a home that was being taken out because it got wet. They had probably about a foot of water in the house, and this is a very tight grain yellow pine that's incredibly resilient. This type of, the grain in this wood is not going to allow a lot of moisture absorption. So the wood really wasn't even wet beyond maybe an eighth of an inch of the surface. It didn't even go deep into the wood. The replacement flooring is below. The replacement flooring is going to be less sustainable. It's going to be more absorption for future moisture. It's not going to be as durable. And so this is something that we're seeing more and more of. So it's really education about how to clean and prepare, how to deal with the storm afterwards. Also, drying, proper drying is another area. I'm going to touch on these in a few minutes. Drink a little tea. Another lesson is that you'll often see structural, kind of hidden structural problems, or maybe issues that people know about or aware about, but actually, and this sadly is an AME church in Halifax that I had met with the week before the hurricane, and they were excited about renovating the building, and then Floyd came through, and the wind damage pretty much caused the building to collapse, and I think probably from hidden structural issues. And also often hidden structural issues or structural issues that are discovered after a storm may not be covered by an insurance company, and I hear this a lot. So you really want to make sure that you don't have problems that might wreak significant structural damage in the event of a storm. And also what materials you use after repair. This is a really well-meaning, wonderful project where they tried to make this building more resilient, historic courthouse more resilient to future events, and just from natural humidity and moisture problems, it's wreaked havoc in the building. So this will be redone hopefully in the very near future again. And it can be very difficult after a storm to find a contractor. Probably one of the, and this is where I'm going to really begin kind of on some of the tips, the secondary tips, is to develop a relationship with a contractor before an event happens. If you don't know of anybody, research, talk to others, find good, competent contractors, experienced contractors, carpenters, people who you can have on your refrigerator to call list in case there's disaster, as well as neighbors and community, having a support team. The house at the top left, this was a March windstorm that took the roof off. Luckily, they had a contractor they could call and get to the site. The one below was during a hurricane, and it took about 3 weeks to get a temporary roof on this historic schoolhouse. So it can really be invaluable to have the name or names of people that you can call on. And often they're able to drop what they're working on and come help you patch a roof, which happened on this property, which took 6 months before they could actually have the roof replaced. So just having a to-call list. Then assessments on buildings. This is something that ideally is done by a professional team that has experience, or an individual that has experience, but just to do a top to bottom inspection, kind of a routine maintenance check of your building to see what problems might exist, what can go wrong. This is was really a wonderful African-American Masonic Lodge in Edenton that sadly had some hidden structural damage in the walls. And again, a weather event, a spring weather event actually caused this building to rack and eventually had to be taken down. So it's really tragic. But just trying to identify potential problems, and they can be simple like this. These are very simple repairs. This is under a school building I looked at that, yeah, it needed a footer under some of the piers and needed a little more securing, but it was a very simple fix. But yet a major windstorm could have been catastrophic to this building. So it's often not something that can be really a big ticket repair item. And sometimes you can do stabilization, not necessarily full repair at the time. And in many cases of masonry, which of course you can see the mortar is deteriorated pretty severely, it doesn't necessarily have to be repaired completely at this time. You could actually do some tuck pointing or deep pointing with appropriate mortar to at least stabilize it, what I like to call a smart band-aid, until it can be repaired properly. So it doesn't always have to be such a scary thing. And this is a church, Rehoboth Church, 1850s church in Washington County, that a nonprofit has acquired and it's done a beautiful job renovating it. But this was a tree limb had obviously fallen on the roof years ago, spotted the structural crack in the roof. So they were able to go in and jack that back up, put two boards beside of it, bolt them together, provide the stability, brace it underneath. And luckily they did that. They also did just followed through with repairs to the windows and also put shutters on the building. And thankfully they did that because a tornado came through and actually peeled off part of the roof. But had they not have secured that roof, they probably would have lost the structure of the roof and also the windows if they had not been repaired. So it really does pay to be prepared. And again, it doesn't have to be a grueling, painful thing to do. This is a church in Elizabeth City that they complained about roof leaks and had been looked at. So we went up, was in town, we went up with a roofing contractor and noticed that the ridge cap had blown off. And that's where the water was coming in. There were also flashing issues. This was a simple fix. But have we had a major rainstorm, they would have taken on quite a bit of damage in the building. And also just sometimes you can actually patch areas of roofing versus replacing. One of the key things in this region that we see really all over the coastal region particularly is just making sure that your roof is properly secure. Now this is certainly, you might say, overdoing it. This is in the highest wind rated zone in the country. This is in Key West on this roof, but yet making sure that particularly your eaves, the ends of your roofing has adequate fasteners on it so that the wind doesn't get up and lift it off. This historic Martin County Courthouse in Williamston had some roof leaks during a nor'easter, and we went up and looked at it, and the roof really needed to be replaced. But prior to another storm that was coming, the roofing contractor donated his time to go up and patch the roof, which really saved the building from getting a lot more water. And ultimately, they replaced the roof after that. But just again, a smart band-aid. The Historic Hope, they replaced the roof on the King Basemore house. They wanted to put, or they plan eventually to put, a wood shingle roof back on all of it, but they decided that at least it's better to put a temporary roof on it, which it was beginning to leak. And this is certainly, I think, a very smart move to protect this building from weather events and just normal rainfall. Of course, looking overhead, potential tree limbs or trees that might fall, just kind of assessing that. And then looking below, is there a moisture problem? And why is this so important in disaster preparedness? Well, you think about if you have a roof with 1,000 square foot of roofing, 1,000 square feet on one side, and that's kind of typical for most homes on one side, you get an inch of rain, that's 600 gallons of water. And that water can do significant damage to a property over time. It can undermine a foundation, and it doesn't really matter if it's even a modern home or an older building. Water can still find its way under in many situations. And this is some of the issues that you'll see: cracks in foundations, certainly wood decay up above, it increases the potential for termite activity, but certainly it's the structural things that we see during storms. So if you have a hurricane or major rain event and you get 15 inches of rain on that 1,000 square foot of roofing, how many gallons is that? It's like pouring the contents of a medium-sized swimming pool on the side of your house. And so where does all that water go? And this is where you see movement, cracks in foundations, chimneys leaning, and sometimes even falling as a result of just excessive amount of rainfall. So getting the water away from the building is something that is really good, smart, practical maintenance anyway, but certainly for a major amount of rain, it can certainly reap huge benefits. And there are many ways to do this, depending on in Northeastern North Carolina, and also I guess certainly in the southeastern part of the state and other portions, it's relatively flat. So it can be complicated to figure it out, but there are ways generally to get that water away. A lot of people have past use French drains. As long as they're pitched properly and maintained, they can be beneficial as well. And also gutters. Gutters can be hugely beneficial. We've got a long history of the use of gutters in historic buildings in North Carolina. But the key thing is not only sizing the gutters properly and getting somebody that can pitch them properly, but carrying the water away from the building at least 10 feet if you can, with a drainage system or something that can be fairly simple to do, can make a huge difference. And this is a temporary drainage that was on the top left, was at the Martin County Courthouse, because after the previous hurricane, the water coming out of the downspout had flooded around the building, flooded the mechanical room in the basement, which has all the electrical equipment. So when the net storm came along, we actually put an extension of cheap corrugated pipe to drain the water out, and that kept the basement from flooding. Below, property owner used it was very clever, cinder blocks to hold down this pipe for a hurricane to carry the volume of water away from the house. And I was called to look at a church in Scotland Neck that had staining in the walls after a big weather event. And as it turned out, there were once gutters on the building, but the roofer thought, well, they're really problematic, let's take them off. And they did. And you can see that water, as a result of that, that's when they started getting a lot of water seeping in through the walls. And the problem here was that the mortar, when it was mixed, didn't quite cure properly. So you've got these hairline cracks all over the building, and the heavy amount of rain that's splashing on these walls was seeping in through these cracks. And the only real fix for this is to replace some mortar, which is going to be expensive. So they put the gutters back on the building, good sized gutters, and they're working fine. So this has helped a lot. They've patched some of the mortar that was in pretty bad shape, but they're often creative solutions that can be affordable, achievable. And it's being creative with older buildings, such as this custom made kind of weather stripping and rain diverter, which for years the cupola house had water coming in the back of it. This clever idea from a local carpenter has worked to keep the water out, and particularly when it's blowing rain. So he made this custom made diverter. And certainly I think Burgwin-Wright House deserves great applause for repairing the shutters and making them operable. They make great storm protection, and just in general for keeping out the sunlight on maybe a harsh afternoon. And in Key West, which again is in the highest wind rated zone in the country, um, where there are surprisingly thousands of over 2,000 National Register listed properties, the local preservation commission and local citizens got together. This is kind of that coffee energetic morning idea of let's get ahead of some of these code issues, figure out how we can retain historic character on these buildings, keep our historic windows, and make them meet high stringent wind codes. So buildings that have operable shutters, they actually have acrylic panels on the backside that you don't see when they're open that meet the wind resistance. And then windows that do not have shutters, they have removable panels that can be added to the windows, which are they're relatively inexpensive, but can certainly provide protection, quick protection. And on the commercial buildings, they're removable, lightweight panels that can be easily fitted on the windows before a storm. So they're still able to retain that wonderful charm and character of the historic buildings, but at the same time provide weather protection in the event of a storm. And on the left is a cupola house after a major storm was coming. They had not yet fixed all the shutters, so they had plywood panels cut to fit. And I think a tool to have in your supply kit is actually, if in the event of a loss of a window, on the right is a simple clamp method plywood panel that can be quickly installed to in a window opening. And it's easy to take it out as well as install it without having to drill or nail into your trim. And this is something that's relatively simple to do. And this is in the first handout that I mentioned on our website, a link to this drawing. And I can email anybody that would like a copy of it. Okay, what about water damage? What happens when you do get water in a historic building? This is St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Windsor in Bertie County, and it actually has been elevated slightly since Floyd initially brought water in the building. You can see how much water, approximately how much water was in the building after Floyd. And I'll have to say, it is absolutely immaculate. You would never, ever know that the building had water in it. The floors are original. Of course, carpeting's been replaced, but they've done a really tremendous job at repairing the building. But how do you protect our resources? I mean, in an ideal world, there are a lot of situations where elevating is the best thing that can happen. And this, thankfully, the Will Willis store and fish house in Ocracoke was elevated about 2 weeks, elevated about 2 weeks before Hurricane Dorian. If it had not been done, that put on a new platform, we probably would have lost this rare surviving building. And this is an example of mid-century modern house in Ocracoke. This was a historic preservation tax credit project where the owners elevated the house. They needed to, but yet they were able to retain the historic character of the building that was originally set low to the ground with some simple techniques and how they configured the stairs, how they did a little simple retaining wall. But a really successful project. You can see the lighthouse over to the right, or this charming 1893 house that actually had been flooded 13 times since 1976. And the owners worked with the owners who rehabilitated this using tax credits. This is their second home. And they were very creative in kind of keeping that historic character. They actually extended the shingles by a couple of rows to kind of give a visual illusion that it doesn't sit up so high. But luckily during Dorian, water did not come into the house. So they were able to successfully elevate this building and protect it from that weather event. And interestingly enough, as many times as this house had been flooded, the woodwork was in fine condition. By and large, they had termite problems from all the water over the years, but they were able to correct that. So there are a lot of different solutions. This again is St. Thomas, but sometimes it's elevating the mechanical equipment. having ways to control water from getting in buildings that maybe cannot be elevated. There's a better way than this. There are actually panels that can be ordered, and so you don't have to the back-breaking work of moving sandbags every time you get a storm. But there are a lot of creative solutions. And at our museums have certainly done some in areas that are prone to flooding. This is in St. Augustine, Florida, where before a previous hurricane, the staff actually moved everything from the ground floor upstairs. They photographed it in its current place, how everything was laid out. And then they kind of trained to do this, moved all the objects out of harm's way, and then put them back. Luckily, this building did not receive any water, but the neighboring building, traditionally known as the oldest house, got water in the basement, got about 2.5 feet of water in the ground floor. They had moved everything upstairs. Once the water receded, they were able to clean the floor and move everything back. The building is done just fine. So there are, and also they've elevated their electrical outlets and things that are in specific rooms. So those hopefully will not be flooded in the future. The National Park Service has come out with this really amazing guide to guidelines for flood adaptation for historic buildings, and it's just packed full of useful tips and information, examples. So encourage you, if you're in a flood area, to take a look at this, and it's really interesting. And they're currently coming out with illustrated guidelines very soon. So what happens if you get water in your building? Well, the first thing is to try to dry it out properly. Above is the Freeman Hotel in Windsor, and it was naturally dried out. And that's the only damage that happened, the only area of flooring that buckled. But I've actually seen walls and buildings pushed out, sodding pushed off, where high heat drying has been used, caused significant damage, and also resulted in having to replace flooring and other issues. So allowing natural ventilation is preferable if you can. Certainly introduction of fans, dehumidifiers. That's to say that many professional companies today actually understand it. They understand how to dry floors, both the top and the bottom, evenly. But we worked with many buildings where they've just been naturally dried with fans, and they've done fine by and large. Also, don't jump to tear out plaster. If it's older plaster, it can be generally repaired and cleaned. Wholesale replacement is sometimes pretty sad to see. This original lime-based plaster torn out of the house, a tremendous expense to repair this versus the approach that this property owner used. And even this, they probably could have taken the baseboards out and dried the walls that way without having to tear off this. But this is certainly much, much better than the first. If you've got drywall, certainly that would need to be cut out if it's gotten flooded. This is a very clever idea. We also did this at St. Thomas Church in Windsor as a demonstration project, but to take off siding, this house has paneling on the inside, so they really couldn't get to the walls to dry them out easily on the inside. So instead of taking the paneling out, they took the siding off to promote dryness. And this property owner actually took out all the flooring, and they planned to put it back, but they didn't necessarily have to do that process. Flooring can often be cleaned and repaired and not taken out. And this is a Freeman Hotel in Windsor that was relocated to a floodplain in the 1980s and has flooded, I think, 4 times since I've been here. And we did a demonstration project, volunteers, and took out, you can see the line where the drywall, this is sheetrock or drywall that got wet, and that had to come out because it would mold on the back. And you can see even when the drywall came out, the insulation behind it was already moldy from just normal condensation. So that was all taken out, allowed to dry properly, and also used a safe wood preservative called Boracare or borates, which actually is ideal to use when the wood is wet. It penetrates into the wood, and it helps reduce potential for fungus, wood decay, future termite activity. a very simple solution. And there are other mildicides out there, but this is one. This is not something that's claimed to prevent mold, but it does help reduce potential. And you can also add a mildicide to this, but there are certainly things that can help reduce the problems. One of the big things that we see is often use of coatings and treatments that can be problematic in general, just in general maintenance on an older or historic building where the material was designed to breathe. This is in a commercial building in Nash County after a pretty significant rainfall where water kind of seeped in behind. You can see this non-breathable coating. It did not perform very well. But traditional buildings, older buildings, typically need to breathe. Wood, brick, and even stone to some degree. If you seal moisture in, it can cause problems. And this is a example in Charleston on the left, a building that had a non-breathable coating that was designed to really keep the water out, but it also kept the water moisture in that was seeping up from the ground, natural rising moisture, air conditioning on the inside, creating problems, and eventually looked at this with an engineer. They had to actually chip this off, and there was a lot of damage to the brick. It was actually causing the brick and mortar to rot behind it. So it was a maintenance problem in general. On the right is the use of a breathable coating. It's either a mineral paint or lime paint that actually allows this traditional masonry, when it gets wet, to breathe and dry out, not creating problems on the inside or the outside. It's also the opportunity to look at better materials and products. This is above a chimney, an area that typically leaks in older homes. A lot of older homes is above a chimney where water will seep in through the plaster, particularly where the plaster is attached directly to the brick. So if you've got artwork, paintings above that, you need to consider moving them before storm. But you can see this lime plaster just got stained. It was structurally fine after it was cleaned and coated with a lime wash. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then on the right, you see a bathroom where you're just continuously painting it after, and it continuously mildewed. And this was a house that was being occupied. And so you've got a lot of mold in this bathroom. You really need to deal with that. So there are things there are products. And again, this is an example of a lime paint. They're often called lime paint whitewash. You can get them in colors. This is a really sustainable material. It's breathable. If it gets wet, it can be touched up. This room was touched up in the area above the mantle. It had been painted 10 years prior with a lime paint. They were able to touch up just that area, not the entire room. So it's I think one of the many things that are out there that can be a useful tool. On the right hand, upper right hand, is a lime wash application on sheetrock or drywall, and it works pretty well. So it's a great technique. Seeking out expert assistance where you can, particularly with complicated buildings. This is Cata Shayemi Church in Edenton that had significant damage during Isabel. Structural engineer donated his time to come down and look at the building and said, yes, it can be saved. But just getting in assistance, and our office, you can contact our office for any names that we know of people that might be able to help, or engineers or contractors. We don't really recommend anybody, but we can certainly share names of people that we know that work with historic buildings, and also for organizations are kind of engaging with our cultural resource emergency support team. There are resources on the website. Adrienne Burney, our coordinator, has been tremendous in pulling together staff and volunteers to assist organizations, not just after disaster, but also in training, so that we can help you be better prepared in the event of a disaster like the flood in this Farmers and Craftsmen Museum in Windsor, where team, staff, and volunteers organized for a few days to help with the recovery efforts there. Again, our website is information. And another tool that has been hugely helpful for properties that have had damage, and also properties in general. Are historic preservation tax credits in North Carolina. Really, really fortunate to have these. North Carolina has a piggyback tax credit that matches the federal credit for income producing properties in tier 1 and 2 counties, but it's a great program. We also have a residential tax credit or 15% tax credit program for properties that are listed on the National Register. And this year, as of January 1st this year, we had over $3.2 billion in historic tax credit projects. So it's a really great tool and resource. And I've had one project in one town, Edenton, that has been flooded twice, and they used the tax credits on that twice because they did not have adequate insurance. So it's really good tool to look for. Also, there are lots of educational opportunities. Our community colleges, Edgecombe Community College has a program. I think Cape Fear Community College in Wilmington has a historic preservation courses now. So I think there are a lot of resources out there, as well as our office CREST team to help. And it's a global thing. One of the best articles I've ever read is this flooding in historic buildings from historic England. It's like it was an eye opener the first time I read it, that, wow, they've been dealing with this issue for centuries in some of these communities, particularly in southern England. So they've come up with some very smart approaches to preparedness and also kind of follow up. So it's learning and sharing with lots of groups. And I think the really important thing, and the reason I'm really strongly encourage preparedness, is to generate that peace of mind. There's no way we can be fully prepared for everything, but to save the nightmare, to know that when you're going to sleep or trying to go to sleep in the middle of a major storm, and you've got water coming in your house, and you've got the buckets out, thankfully, you've got the towels out, and you're collecting that water, to at least know that you've got somebody you can call at 6 o'clock in the morning and say, help, I need you to come patch my roof, that they'll be there. Or you have neighbors, or you'll know what to do if you've got structural damage to your house, and working with your community. So I think it's really important to plan as much as you can, and make it not a grueling task, but make it an opportunity. And it's really, preservation is all about our precious historic properties or resources, really all about people. Stories. This youthful 102-year-old Edith Sollings has saved the historic courthouse in Edenton not once, but twice. She helped to preserve it. And she would call me about every storm that was coming that way. Well, I'm worried about this. What should we do? Or we had water in the basement a couple of times. So it's really, preservation is all about people. And so I think I've packed in a lot, and look forward to fielding any questions. And so I'll turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Reid. That was fantastic. So we are in the webinar format. So if any of our attendees does have questions, there should be a Q&A button. You can type in your questions, and we'll get those answered for you. Also, so I have a few questions from just the presentation. You had mentioned volunteering with, you were volunteering with the National Trust. Is there, how do you recommend people go about starting to volunteer, or should it start locally? How do you get involved with organizations that help out in the community?
Generally, it does start locally, but there are, like our CREST team, we will have volunteer opportunities for that. Just reaching out if you're interested in historic buildings, or if you're interested in it depends on what you're particularly interested in. If you're interested in buildings, you can contact me or our office, and I can certainly share. There's emergency heritage responders. There's National Trust. There are a lot of different avenues that people can become engaged in. So I would say just reach out and we'll be glad to send a list or contacts to anybody that has an interest in that. But certainly community, your neighbors, getting together with your neighbors and community groups.
Wonderful, thank you. Now you mentioned a few different tax offerings. Are there other grants or other resources for historic properties to prepare for disasters before they hit? So if there are tax credits for getting things repaired, what about anything if you're trying to start preparing, start outfitting your historic property? Are there resources for doing things before?
There are potential resources for organizations, nonprofits. There are various grants that you certainly could apply for. And I think I've seen some organizations applying for kind of steps to stabilize, prepare for different foundations with great success, because they look at that as an opportunity to do something a little bit different and creative. But for individual property owners, it's really trying to reach out to your community and getting support there to see if as a team effort, there's a way to be better prepared as a community. But there's not really any individual grants that I'm aware of for individuals. But for organizations, for local governments, there's often grants that can be accessed through different avenues. There's so be glad if anybody has questions on that. Be glad to field those if they want to contact us.
Great, thank you. And then my last question is, the whole starting to get into prep, if you have a historic property, what is the very first step you should take? You are having your property that you, as far as you know, you don't know where to begin. What is the very first step to take getting prepared?
The first step is to really, I would say the very first thing is to do documentation, to go and document everything, to walk around with your camera, take pictures, every room, exterior, just to have that documentation is so important. And certainly working with your insurance company to make sure you've got adequate coverage. But then to research, to read articles, to look at preparedness lists, and start coming up with the list of things you need to have on hand. Things that you need to, what do you need to do if we've got a windstorm? What's a risk? Is a risk wind, water, both? And then what do you need to do? For example, if we're having a big storm, one of the key things, hurricane, for example, is being prepared to shut the power off. So that you get surges, you'll have damage in property. So it's really kind of researching what are the risks to your home, your property, your organization, and how can you be better prepared? What are the resources out there? And then certainly kind of coming up with your own custom list, and as well as doing that assessment, doing the top to bottom, kind of a walk around routine maintenance check of your home, keeping in mind disaster preparedness. It sounds like a lot of effort, and sometimes it can be, but it's really, if you start working on it in small bits, it's really not that, often not that difficult.
Excellent. Thank you. So we have a question from Caroline. Can you email me a list of potential grants? I'm a curator of a local museum located in a floodplain in Canton, North Carolina.
Okay, sure. What I'll do is I'll send, if I can, Christine, I'll send you a list of grants that we know about for historic properties for organizations. And I'll forward that to you if that's okay, and then you can share it.
Absolutely, I'll do that. I know that afterwards we are planning on sending out a follow-up email with various links, and we'll include the list of grants that comes through with that. So. All right. Are there any other questions? All right, fantastic. Well, if there are any questions later on, feel free to email us back here at info@burgwin-wrighthouse.com, and we can certainly pass those on and get those questions answered. Reid, thank you again so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your expertise and sharing this, really, really important topic that all of us are very invested in.
Well, thank you very much, and thank everybody for participating. And we're still learning, so please share your thoughts, your guidance, any ideas you've got as well. Greatly appreciate it, and look forward to participating in a future program for the site. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Reid. And thank you to all the attendees. Again, we'll be sending out a follow-up email just with some final links and information. And again, feel free to email us if you have any questions. Thank you, guys, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.